Hey everyone, it's your host Russ Altman from The Future of Everything. It's summertime, and for many of us that means a recreational trip to the beach or the coast. Worldwide, billions of people live year-round near a coastline, and these settings can be responsible for everything from buffering storms and preventing sea level rise to fishing, flourishing tourism, and trade. For all of these reasons, the acceleration of coastal erosion is an important topic to understand. A couple of years ago, I sat down with Jane Willenbring, a geoscientist who says that by studying what coastlines looked like long ago, we can better understand where they are headed and how to protect them. No matter where you live, coast or not, I hope you'll tune in to better understand the forces behind coastal erosion. Before we jump into this episode, a reminder to please rate and review the podcast. It'll help our audience grow, and it'll help us improve. So we all know that sea level is rising, and we all know that one of the big consequences of that is loss of coastline. How does the coast even form, and then how does it degrade, and why does it matter? Well, the impacts on infrastructure and on human life and societal impact is quite non-trivial. And today we have Professor Jane Willenbring from Stanford University to tell us about it. She's a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences and Earth System Science at Stanford University, and she's an expert on landscape and coastal erosion. So Jane, one of your interests, of course, is coastal erosion. And to start, what are the processes that lead to the buildup or the breakdown of coastal areas?
Yeah, so one of the really important things, and one of the things that I really love about studying the coastal environment, is that it's incredibly dynamic. And so if we think about coastlines, we think about places that are changing all the time. And so in California in particular, some of the processes that are going on are obviously wave action. We also have pronounced wave action, especially when there are storms. And we also have things like water flow through coastal cliffs that can impact when cliffs fail on the coastline. Of course, we have buildup and loss of sand that happens seasonally, especially in some seasons when we have big storms. And so one of the, we can think about it from a perspective of how the ocean is impacting the cliffs, but then also the nature of the cliffs themselves, what they're made of, how steep they are, you know, if there's been any kind of seismic activity like earthquakes or faults or any kind of jointing or anything like that in the cliffs themselves.
So when I've just living life and being at I grew up on the East Coast, I now live on the West Coast, I've watched coasts, from a distance. And I don't see a lot. It always seems like things are kind of receding. But is it true that like the coasts everywhere are always receding? Or you made a brief mention of buildup. Like what leads to actually the addition of coast? Or is there anything that leads to the addition of coast?
Yeah, I mean, in places, especially by river mouths, we get the buildup of coastal material. Right now, your observations were very astute because right now we're in a period of sea level rise. And so in periods of sea level rise, on the East Coast, we have the drowning of estuaries. And we have a lot of waves that are closer to the cliffs on the West Coast, where we have actively uplifting land surfaces. And so it does, your perception is correct. It does seem like we're losing coasts in a lot of places. In other places, like where the river mouths and deltas, for example, we also have buildup of land.
Gotcha. Okay, good. So, and I haven't spent as much time by rivers, so that's interesting that I have a totally kind of biased sample. So I know that you're an engineer, and one of the things you do is innovate in the area of measuring this erosion, because as we always say, you can't intervene in anything if you can't measure it. So tell me a little bit about your measurement technologies and what are the challenges of understanding how things change. I don't even know if it's day to day, month to month, or eon to eon. And I suspect you're interested in all of the above.
Yeah. So I'm actually trained as a scientist. So my perspective is maybe a little longer term than the average coastal engineer. And so there are folks who are doing a lot of monitoring of coastal environments that use LiDAR, which is kind of like a laser level, if you are familiar with that Carpenter tool. But
I think they're using them in self-driving cars as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. And so you can use those, that technology that is actually from satellite data to understand over the period of monitoring how cliffs evolve and change. You can also go out there and just look. So those are things that happen over a short period of time. So my role as a geomorphologist, who is someone who I like to say studies the science of scenery, is someone who will go out and kind of look over a longer term. So we can look at over hundreds of years, even before people were really monitoring and measuring the coastal environment, or millennia, to figure out how different the modern rates of retreat are from the past, like kind of natural baseline rates of retreat.
Great. So tell me how you do that, because obviously we didn't have GPS 100 years ago, so you don't have any, and we didn't even have photography 200 years ago, say. And so obviously you have a problem of setting the baseline and then looking for the delta, the change. Delta, good word. So tell me a little bit about how you can make such measurements over these time periods.
Yeah, so we use kind of what I like to think of as a bit of a fancy technique called cosmogenic isotopes. So isotopes are variants of different elements that have different amounts, different masses. And some of those isotopes that we can extract and measure are formed only through the interaction with cosmic radiation, which sounds sort of like a sci-fi novel, right? Something out of Fantastic Four, right?
It definitely does. Cosmic rays are going to help you measure the coast.
Yes, that's right. So those cosmic rays produce certain isotopes that are only produced in that way. And then we can take a rock sample, for example, from a coastal platform, think like a tide pool, and we can figure out how long something has been exposed to cosmic radiation at the Earth's surface. And then we can calculate a rate. So if we have a sort of a long shore platform that extends into the ocean, maybe 300 feet or so, we can take samples all along there and figure out how long those different parts have been exposed to these cosmic rays. And that gives us a rate.
Could this involve going into an archaeological situation and kind of finding layers of rock that are not currently being exposed, but you see evidence that they were exposed, and then you can kind of say, okay, something must have happened to move this rock off the coast, into the ground?
Yeah, so some places you have more of an archaeological record of settlements that have been there in the past and are now in a different place. People are usually setting up shop near water sources, right. Or, near sources where they can launch a boat or something like that. And so it's really common to have a settlement that's near a coastline. And now that settlement was abandoned because that coastline is no longer in that particular place. And so that is one way that a lot of people measure such things. And it's been a long history of figuring out what people have done in the context of, environmental change, because we've, as a species, we've really been very good at adapting to differences in, the environment and the landscape around us.
Right. Okay, great. So, that was very helpful, because now we kind of see what you're measuring and that you can get these exposures. I had, while you were describing this, it occurred to me that this must be extremely complex, because as you know better than I, it's not just the erosion that's happening. There are plate tectonics, and there are earthquakes, and there are things like that. So I'm guessing that you have to deconvolute lots of processes in order to isolate the impact of these things on the coast versus things moved because of an earthquake or because of other things. Is that true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in some places in the world, we have to kind of think about relative sea level. So sometimes sea level seems to actually be going down in certain places, even though globally sea level is rising.
Right.
And that's because the land surface is being pushed up by tectonic forces. And that's one of the things that happens, especially along the California and west coast of the United States and Alaska.
Great. So I know that one of the things you're passionate about is studying the impacts of it's not just how the erosion happens and how fast it's happening, but also the impacts both on humans and on, as you said, you study the landscape. So let's get to humans second. But first, tell me about what are the impacts on the infrastructure and on the actual coast. Like, what are we seeing, and what catches your attention and makes you either concerned or excited or whatever the right verb would be?
Yeah, I mean, if you kind of invoke sort of a coastal environment in your mind, you probably think of like a home perched on top of a cliff that looks like it's going to fall into the ocean. And so, of course, that's concerning because that person is going to lose their home. But then we also have things like lots of different kinds of infrastructure. We have roads and railroads. The coastline in Southern California goes right up alongside the beach.
It's spectacular.
Maybe a couple meters away. We have the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant that is nestled right up there. I only laugh
because I don't know what else to do.
I know. It's really bizarre and maybe not a great idea. But we also have, like water treatment plants and military installations. And so airports. And so there are all kinds of different reasons to be concerned about this. And so that's one of the things that I think is really, really important and interesting is just like there are so many people who are stakeholders. And if you fix one thing in one place, which is kind of the engineer approach, you ruin something in another place. And so it really takes kind of a holistic view in order to figure out how to solve some of these problems from a policy perspective.
So as a scientist who's pursuing knowledge about the fundamental processes that are leading to this, I can't imagine that you're not kind of sucked into the policy and the planning aspects of this. Are you? Do you have people from, say, California or from Florida calling you up saying, we need help? And if they are calling you, what are the questions that they're asking? Yeah,
so I think it intersects with policy in the sense that we can really tell how, if we were thinking about erosion of landscapes, especially coastal landscapes, these happen very fast. And so people can see this happening, but then it doesn't happen in some ways fast enough from a policy perspective for, someone in their term of office to actually make like really unpopular decisions, because probably in 4 years, maybe not too much will happen, maybe something. And so we have these sort of episodic events where something will happen and then nothing for another 5 years, and then something else will happen. And so this is not ideal from a policy perspective. People want something that is going to happen for sure. And so the long-term view, I think, is really important in that sense, because we can tell people this is the amount that the coastline is going to retreat over the next, decade, 2 decades, 50 years, 100 years. And so if we have to invoke something like managed retreat, where people actually are moved away from the coastline, where railroads are moved away from the coastline, that is something where we can actually give people advance notice, which you'd think would be a good thing.
Right.
Sometimes it's totally ignored, but in an ideal world, we could actually influence some future planning.
Are you seeing policymakers and public leadership open to your projections, or is it still an issue of even getting them to pay attention?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some wins. So recently in Southern California around Del Mar, that's where this coaster line, that's one of the busiest Amtrak lines in the country. They've actually invested $300 million to move it away from the coastline so it doesn't completely fall into the ocean. So that was a huge amount of money to be spent. Probably they wouldn't have had to spend so much if this had been, decided upon years ago. Now it's kind of an emergency rush job because it was, every now and then it's closed down because of a bluff failure. And this also costs, human lives. In 2019, 3 people died because of bluff erosion around Encinitas.
So I'm interested. I know this is a little bit in the weeds, but is the solution not to build a bridge and to just leave the tracks where they are, but support them in another way versus moving them? And it sounds like in this case they're going to move them. Is building the bridge ever a good option, or is that just delaying the what's going to happen eventually, which is the water is simply too deep and you can't get structural stability?
I think it's problematic to build a bridge because a lot of times when you build a bridge, you're also kind of hardening the infrastructure around the bridge so the bridge doesn't collapse.
Right.
And anytime you do that to this dynamic environment, you're really going to affect some of the, kind of up coast and down coast areas and how they accumulate sand. And so you can really make your neighbors angry by doing such a thing.
Great. So in the last few seconds for this segment, before we take a break, I have to ask you, in one of your papers, you refer to landscape unzipping, and I just needed to ask what that is.
Oh, so if you imagine a sort of like a plateau, sometimes streams are cutting through that plateau, and the way that they cut through it is they start at the bottom, and then they create more of a valley as they move upstream.
Okay.
And so that is the unzipping of that landscape.
I see. And you get multiple. I actually know this. I think I know this phenomenon from the west coast of California, where you see these. They look like rivers that are coming down from the hills, but they are creating all of these lines through the bluffs and through the cliffs.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another way, that's separate from the coastal erosion, but that's another thing, that can impact homes on some of these high plateaus.
This is The Future of Everything with Russ Altman. More with Jane Willenbring next. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. This is Russ Altman, and I'm speaking with Professor Jane Willenbring from Stanford University. In the last segment, Jane told us about coastal erosion, how she measures it, and what we do about it. In this segment, she'll tell us about the different ways in which sea level rise is impacting the coast, and also some of the human impacts. In this segment, Jane, I wanted to ask you about sea level rise. You made a couple of references to it before, but it's something that we're all seeing. We literally get updates in the news every week or month about how things are going. People are working very hard to try to stem sea level rise. What are the ways in which sea level rise is impacting our coasts?
Yeah, so sea level rise is problematic. And of course, depending on where you are, the rate of sea level rise is going to be different depending on what the land surface is doing. But generally, it's about 1/8 an inch a year these days. And one of the things people really worry about is that, we're going to have some kind of episodic, kind of catastrophic loss of ice masses, which is going to increase that rate in a big way in lots of places around the world. And the kind of intuitive way that sea level rise impacts coastlines is that you can imagine that the water level, as it increases, you're going to flood a lot of the sandy areas, which actually protects coastlines. And then you're going to have those waves that are closer to whatever coastal cliff is going to be around there. And so that's really problematic on the West Coast. On the East Coast, you are familiar probably with submergence and how things are going to flood. And so that's really one way that we have the impact of sea level rise on the East Coast, where we don't have such dramatic topography right at the coastline.
Right. So in addition to the flooding, are there other patterns of damage that are perhaps not appreciated that we should be on the lookout for? I don't know if there's changes in the shape or of the coast, or the way in which the coast articulates with the ocean. I'm just wondering if flooding is number one, and what's number two?
Yeah, so flooding of the coastlines is a big one. And then again, like anytime you have some of your water level higher, you're able to move offshore a lot of the sandy material that again, like protects those coastlines. So they've found like the wider the beach, the lower the rate of erosion of the coastal cliffs on the West Coast. And so those beach environments are really some of the best defenses against coastal erosion. And so if you're eroding those beaches, not only do you not get a nice beach to go to, I'm sure you like to go to the beach.
Yes, I do. I do.
Yes, everyone does. So it's also a huge thing for a lot of local economies, is just, having that beach environment. And so we're really thinking about like, in the future, are we not going to have any beaches? Like that just sounds horrible to me. I do go to the beaches around here in California, and I see these big cliffs, 20, 30 feet of like basically sand. When they collapse, do they create a new beach and give us a little bit of time before the next collapse is going to happen? Because I would imagine that mass kind of forms a little bit of a little bit of a sandbar that then gives us some time before we have to wait about the next collapse. So is that the natural cycle, or is it much more complicated than that? Yes, that is actually like one of the ways in which we naturally replenish beaches. And so that's why when people are, really worried about their home and they artificially harden the coastline using concrete, right, or a bunch of boulders and things like that, you're actually removing that source of sand. So you have to think about, if someone were to do that, should they pay some kind of like sand tax or something? Right. Because they're really ruining the presence of the beach for other people. Right. And so you're right, though, that is one way that we protect that particular coastline, is just in that little apron of material. Yes. That's why it's so episodic too. Yes. Sometimes after you get a big beach failure and collapse, then it's hard to erode that particular spot, and then you'll erode either up coast or down coast of that area.
So in the last 5 minutes, I wanted to talk about another area that I know you're interested in, which is, we talked about the infrastructure impacts, but there are human and social impacts of this coastal erosion. What are the ones that get your attention, and what are people doing about them?
Yeah, I mean, if you invoke like that idea in California of like who is living on the coastline, you think like, well, not a big deal. This is probably the vacation home or something. Right, some of those fancy houses. Like
some of them are hard to feel sorry. It's hard to feel.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't want to be heartless, but sometimes it's not your number one sympathy target.
No, of course not. But there are a lot of communities where it is not a really wealthy person that lives there. And there are a lot of places where, even just the highway, passes through a place. And so it affects a lot of people who really need to get to work to go to their jobs. Yes. And of course, for example, Alaska, there are a lot of indigenous people whose villages are right near the coastline. And so, the current way is that the federal government will like actively move people inland when they're at risk of their village going into the ocean. And those rates of cliff retreat and coastal retreat are, 30 meters a year sometimes. I mean, really, really fast.
That's big. So it's not just
huge. Yes. And so, so there are a lot of just displacements that are going to happen. And for whatever reason, people just do not have the appetite or the stomach to think about, their homes and their places are very important to them. And, it's a beautiful place to live. And so there are a lot of really fraught conversations that we're going to have about who gets to build along the coastline and what happens to people who are already there and where should they go.
Yes, and I'm sure that there's complex legal issues about like what happens to your land if it gets, especially if the government prematurely, like it's not underwater yet, but the government is telling you this is happening, and you're looking at your land thinking, why are you doing this to me? And it's the same thing about the kinetics of how fast this happens and when people are willing to face the reality. And I made the joke about the rich people, but it's probable that just because of the numbers, that probably it might. My guess would be that there would be many low-income people many more low-income people displaced by this than the high-income people, because they just have one house and a lot of land. But in villages and things, and we saw what happened in Maui with the fires, that's thousands of people who just live there, just having their life, and they're not particularly wealthy. So how about, are there health implications to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, there's the active physical threat of actually being crushed by a collapsing cliff, which I'm laughing about because it sounds horrible and awful, not because I think it's funny. But then there's also a lot of, thinking about water treatment plants. And if there is a storm surge, for example, or if that water treatment plant, has a 1 decade lifetime because of coastal erosion, that's really going to affect a lot of people. And it also creates, a lot of uncertainty about, if we have to go to desalination plants, what that is going to look like, where those would go. And so, as always, a lot of these problems are, have fingers in lots of different areas that affect human health.
So, and the final thing I want to ask you, again, just out of curiosity, is sometimes we see people planting plants in order to protect the coast. Like they say, we're going to put in these plants, they're going to help provide a barrier. You see this especially along rivers, but also I think at the ocean. What is the role of vegetation, or is that not a big enough hammer to kind of stop any of these big processes?
Yeah, so a lot of the early efforts to really use, especially invasive plants, people have tried to plant bamboo where it didn't belong. Ice plant in Southern California is really common. That has actually been a negative in terms of how coasts respond. It creates like a lot of buildup of sediment and not a slow erosion of that surface. And then it kind of like is a capacitor where it fails all at once after that happens. And so that's probably not a great thing. Native plants are probably a better choice. There's a lot of interest in, how we could use kelp, for example, to not harden the coastline necessarily, but to soften the waves, which ultimately probably would not really help in the long term, but it might kind of delay some of these big storm events.
It's such a nice idea to see all of those kelp and they're just like buffering the waves and making them a little bit less powerful. And then I suppose there's nothing to do on the side of a cliff. There's nothing to grow there that's going to stop it from falling.
No, not really. There's like some little, what are called biofilms. They're kind of like an algae that actually kind of help to stabilize some of
that's interesting.
And then another thing that comes up a lot in Southern California and Northern California is when people have like lawns on top of the cliff. And so they'll usually irrigate, and that adds water to the system. And anytime you're adding water to the system, it creates less rain that you need in order to cause a failure. So there are some human impacts that are related to like how people use the land on the surface.
I see. And we would prefer for them not to be watering the lawns too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because to get those super green lawns, and like especially probably seen, golf courses right there.
Yes.
Also bad, as you might imagine.
Yes. Thanks to Jane Willenbring. That was The Future of Coastal Erosion. You have been listening to The Future of Everything with Russ Altman. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider subscribing or following it so you will receive news of the new episodes and you'll never be surprised by the future of anything. Maybe tell your friends about the podcast too, and definitely rate and review it. We have more than 200 episodes in the back catalog, and you might go check out some of those which are still evergreen and good. You can connect with me on many social media platforms such as Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky, at RB Altman or at Russ B. Altman. You can also follow Stanford Engineering on social media at Stanford School of Engineering or at Stanford ENG.